Hello everyone, I'm Stephen McInerney, Senior Lecturer in Literature at Campion College. This paper is called A Servant of God, a Stubborn, Defiant Maid, Sigrid Undset's Kristen Lavransdatter. GK Chesterton reflected on love, sex and marriage with his unique mixture of realism and idealism. The first two facts which a healthy boy or girl feels about sex are these. First, that it is beautiful, and then that it is dangerous. He said that marriage is a duel to the death which no man of honour should decline, and described it elsewhere as a perpetual crisis. Sigrid Undset's trilogy Kristen Lavransdatter bears out the truth of all three statements. Kristen is one of the great heroines in the history of the novel, deserving of her place alongside Emma Bovary as a woman who defied and was punished for defying social conventions in the name of passionate love. Unlike Emma, however, Kristen's end is not tragic. Instead, in accordance with her author's Christian vision, she is redeemed by finally and decisively embracing the cross of Christ, inverting the fate of the fallen woman, so familiar to us in the 19th century novel, without any sacrifice of the earthy realism that provides the backdrop to such narratives. Written in the third decade of the 20th century, the Kristen Lavransdatter trilogy is a story of inversions in other ways. It inverts the expectations we have for medieval romance literature by consistently highlighting the reality of sin and the toughness and dangers of medieval culture caught between heathenism and Christianity. At the end of the first novel of the trilogy, the willful Kristen gets her man, despite her father's reluctance. But the expected joy of her wedding is overshadowed by her anxiety at the suffering she has caused her parents, by her anger at Erland for getting her pregnant but remaining blissfully unaware of the fact, and later, by the ambiguous relocation to Hussaby, Erland's estate, where Kristen feels and is treated as an outsider, as she struggles to take charge of an estate in disrepair. Writing on domesticity, Chesterton argued that of the two sexes, the woman is the one in the more powerful position, because, having chief responsibility for hearth and home, she, he says, can do as she likes. But Kristen is not the first woman Erland has brought to Hussaby, and consequently her authority over the homestead is never completely accepted by those on the estate. In this way, Undset was more of a realist than Chesterton, perhaps because, as a woman, she was less prone to idealising womankind or domestic labour. Chesterton knew this to be true, as he said himself, women are the only realists. Their whole object in life is to pit their realism against the extravagant, excessive and occasionally drunken idealism of men. Kristen Lavransdatter also inverts our age's secular expectations. For Kristen does not find lasting happiness in any worldly or material sense, despite outwardly gaining a great deal in Hussaby and being blessed with many healthy sons. Instead, she increasingly realises, as we move through the second and third volumes of the trilogy, through a series of hard lessons and repeated backsliding, that in this world we have no lasting abode. Her husband is a disappointment to her. Her sons grow distant from her as they grow more and more in their father's image. Her father, the source of her sense of stability, dies, followed soon by her mother. And finally, through Erland's imprudence and adultery, Kristen loses everything that she and her husband had worked to build. In a final humiliation for Kristen, Erland abandons her, leading to suspicion that her last-born child is not his. Kristen is accused of adultery as a consequence, suggesting that she has never been able quite to overcome the suspicion of her character that began in the first novel with her innocent dalliance with her young friend Anne, her near rape by the cleric Benton, her rejection of her betrothed Simon, and her clandestine relationship with Erland, which she undertook while she was still betrothed to Simon. As rumours spread, she loses the respect of her old neighbours at Urengard, and just as importantly, she almost loses her good standing in the church, thus coming close to the fate of her mentor, the excommunicated Fru Aschhild, who is popularly believed to be a witch, and who is suspected of betraying and killing her first husband. Kristen also falls out with her sister, Ramborg, who has gone on to marry the man Kristen rejected, Simon. Ramborg envies Kristen's beauty and attractiveness to men, and above all, Simon's persistent love for Kristen, which overshadows, in Ramborg's eyes, the love that he has and ought to have for her. Kristen, as such, more or less loses everything that is important to her. All that is, except God. I want to consider the idea of loss and renunciation in the trilogy generally, in order to illuminate the important choices that Kristen makes at three crucial stages in the trilogy. The choice to marry Erland, the decision to cure Simon's son using witchcraft, and the decision to save the life of the orphan at the end of the work. These three episodes relate to one another in that on each occasion, Kristen is presented with the choice to follow Christ or to follow sin. Loss and renunciation help her, in the last example, to choose Christ once and for all. The final choice exorcises the demons of the old heathen dispensation that divides the hearts to varying degrees of each of the main characters in the trilogy, especially Erland. One of the great ironies in Kristen's life is that, having gone through so much to get Erland, the marriage of the two is consistently dogged by misunderstanding. Drawn together by sexual and emotional passions, Kristen and Erland, in the cold light of day, are divided as passion gives way to bitterness. It is appropriate, therefore, that the second volume of the trilogy, The Wife, should begin not with the fervour of passionate romance, nor even the intrigue and passion of outright evil, such as we see in the dramatic death of Erland's mistress in the first volume, The Wreath, but with something utterly domestic, ordinary, and awful, Kristen vomiting from seasickness and morning sickness. Erland wants Kristen to restore honour to his name and his estate, yet the presence of a child under Kristen's belt, months too soon, makes this impossible. The home is lice-ridden, the horses and the fields are unkempt, the supplies are low, and the manners and customs are generally at variance with those that Kristen is used to from her childhood in Urengard. Thus begins the repeated comparison between Erland's Hussaby and Lavrans's Urengard, and therefore between Erland and Lavrans, which culminates in the third novel, The Cross, with the dramatic scene where Kristen implies that Erland is not worthy to sit in Lavrans's chair, an insult which leads to their separation. The tension between Erland and Kristen climaxes when, for the first of two times, Erland strikes her. This happens after Kristen races off through the forest as Erland mocks Lavrans's customs. It is worth noting that immediately prior to this act of violence, Erland discovers that Kristen is pregnant. Moreover, in getting into bed that night, he cuts his hand on a knife, which symbolically links this moment with the child Kristen's encounter with the elf maiden at the start of the wreath, where her hands are bloodied after rushing up the slope. It is worth pausing for a moment over that earlier episode, since the symbolic logic of the entire trilogy turns on it. Kristen heard a stream trickling and gurgling somewhere nearby. She walked toward the sound until she found it, and then she lay down on a slab of rock and washed her sweaty, mosquito-bitten face and hands. Beneath the rock slab, the water stood motionless in a deep black pool. On the other side, a sheer rock rose up behind several slender birch trees and willow thickets. It made the finest mirror, and Kristen leaned over and looked at herself in the water. She wanted to see if what Sigrid had said was true, that she resembled her father. She smiled and nodded and bent forward until her hair met the blonde hair framing the round young face with the big eyes that she saw in the water. Then Kristen picked some blossoms and carefully bound them together with blades of grass until she had the loveliest, pinkest, and most tightly woven wreath. The child pressed it down on her hair and ran over to the pool to see how she looked, now that she was adorned like a grown-up maiden about to go to a dance. She bent over the water and saw her own dark image rise up from the depths and become clearer as it came closer. Then she saw in the mirror of the stream that someone was standing among the birches on the other side and leaning toward her. Abruptly, she straightened up into a kneeling position and looked across the water. At first, she thought she saw only the rock face and the trees clustered at its base, but suddenly she discerned a face among the leaves. There was a woman over there, with a pale face and flowing flaxen hair. Her big light grey eyes and her flaring pale pink nostrils reminded Kristen of Guldsveins, her horses. She was wearing something shiny and leaf green, and branches and twigs hid her figure up to her full breasts, which were covered with brooches and gleaming necklaces. Kristen stared at the vision. Then the woman raised her hand and showed her a wreath of golden flowers and beckoned to her with it. Behind her, Kristen heard Guldsvein whinny loudly with fear. She turned her head. The stallion reared up, gave a resounding shriek, and then whirled around and set off up the hillside, making the ground thunder. The other horses followed. They rushed straight up the scree so that rocks plummeted down with a crash, and branches and roots snapped and cracked. Then Kristen screamed as loud as she could. "Father," she shrieked, "Father!" She sprang to her feet and ran up the slope after the horses, not daring to look back over her shoulder. She clambered up the scree, tripped on the hem of her dress and slid down, then climbed up again, scrabbing onward with bleeding hands. Her father came bounding toward her, calling her name, and Kristen sank down, realizing that now she was saved. Sancta Maria. Lavrans knelt down next to his daughter and pulled her to him. His face was pale, and there was a strange look to his mouth that frightened Kristen even more. Not until she saw his face did she realize the extent of her peril. It was a woman. She beckoned to me with a wreath of gold. I think it was a dwarf maiden, Father. Jesus Christus, said Lavrans softly, making the sign of the cross over the child and himself. He pulled out the golden chain with the reliquary cross from inside his shirt and hung it around Kristen, placing it against her own skin. The encounter with the elf maiden introduces the reader to the tension between Christianity and paganism, which is such a major theme of the trilogy. There is no question within the world of the novel that we are supposed to take the event as real. Elf maidens and other spirits are as much a part of the real world in the novel as water, bread, wine, wood, the sacraments of the church, and in their own way they are just as mysterious. This is still very much a picture of the world prior to its modern disenchantment, as Charles Taylor has described it. Such realism is the ground for, rather than opposed to, the symbolic or allegorical meaning of the event, and symbolises the first breach in Kristen's innocence as she emerges with a torn dress and bleeding hands. Related to this, Kristen leans over the water to admire her reflection and is thus clearly associated with the myth of Narcissus, who was drowned on account of his self-love. Kristen is kneeling over the water when the elf maiden appears, suggesting that the pagan world offers an alternative for worship to the God of Christianity. The vision that Kristen has, the elf maiden shows her a wreath of golden flowers, is suggestive of marriage, but here the elf maiden is offering her an eternal marriage to the mountain king and an eternal escape into the woods. After she meets Erland, he actualises in some ways the myth of the mountain king, but reality soon enough intervenes to remove Kristen from her reverie. The true nature of Erland's character gradually dawns on Kristen as the trilogy progresses. On the one hand, Erland emerges more and more as someone above other men, in manliness, courage, adventurousness. On the other hand, he is morally inferior to the more prosaic men in Kristen's life, and in this sense is beneath Lavrans and to a certain extent Simon. In addition to his bad habits, Kristen is appalled by his manners at table, for example, he is thoroughly immature. Instead of being happy at Kristen's pregnancy, for example, he is angry that his plans to parade her on his estate before Lavrans and his kin are disrupted. Moreover, he fails to defend Kristen against the innuendo of other characters. To make matters worse for Kristen, Erland never seems to learn from his failings. He repeatedly makes the same mistakes and is constantly unaware of the effect of his actions on others. Simon notes that Erland has such a rare talent for forgetting. Nor does he show any awareness of the inconsistencies in his own code. Where Kristen sins through brooding too much on Erland's sins, neither forgiving nor forgetting his many failings, he, by contrast, is too quick to forget and too quick to forgive himself. He blames Kristen for his adultery with Fru Sunniva and insults her by describing his own wife as a holy witch, an accusation which hurts all the more because it contains an element of truth. No episode more clearly reveals the ambiguities and inconsistencies of Erland's character than his being discovered as a traitor to the authority of the king. Erland's knightly qualities, his courage, his loyalty, his grace under pressure, are all revealed in abundance in this episode. So it is that when he is sentenced to death, he listened to his sentence with a steadfast, calm expression, and he had greeted the gentlemen of the royal retinue in just as courteous, open, and splendid a manner when he was led out as when he had been escorted in. He was calm and cheerful. But these noble qualities are coupled with imprudence and unreliability. He is only caught in his treachery as a result of his adulterous affair, stupidly leaving the secret letters of the conspiracy in the presence of his mistress, who reveals them to his enemies. Getting involved in the conspiracy in the first place was a wild and imprudent act, given his situation with a wife and children dependent on him. It was true, Undset writes, that Erland himself was to blame for the whole endeavour, resulting in nothing more than misfortune for him and the good man who had been exposed by his foolish philandering. The man who took such great plans onto his shoulders, and no one knows how important they might have been to the welfare of all of us here in Norway and to our descendants for many years to come. He set them all aside, along with his breeches, on the bed of a wanton woman. Erland takes great pride in having never betrayed a man involved in the conspiracy and in revealing and ironic moment, he declares to Simon, "I have never betrayed anyone who has put their trust in me." But as Undset writes pointedly, it was obvious that he truly believed this about himself. Of course, he has betrayed the person who above all others placed her trust in him, Kristen. There is a sense then of inevitability about Erland's demise, since he is represented by Undset as reckless and unstable. His spirit of adventure takes him away from home on numerous occasions in his boat, and finally he seeks the freedom of the distant retreat in Hågen. Even there, he cannot comprehend why Kristen will not join him, leaving their children behind. He yearns for a life without responsibilities and obligations, and it is his stubborn pursuit of this that leads, though indirectly, to the final tragedy in the marriage of Kristen and Erland, the calumniation of Kristen by the priest and the villagers who speculate on why husband and wife are living apart and who suspect Kristen of adultery. To defend her honour, Erland is drawn out of the mountains, back to Urengard, is wounded in combat, and dies. Fundamentally, the difference between Erland and Kristen is the difference of self-awareness. Kristen suffers from her divisions, pulled in all directions between the flesh and the spirit, her parents and Erland, between paganism and Christianity, whereas Erland simply is and simply does. He suffers no agonies in his choices, only as a result of them, whereas Kristen is constantly caught between two worlds. I want then to turn to those three decisions that I briefly touched on a few moments ago and look at them one by one in detail. Towards the end of The Wife, the second novel of the trilogy, after Erland's affair and his treachery have been exposed and he has been dragged to prison, Kristen reflects on the choice she made to marry Erland. She had chosen him herself. She had chosen him in an ecstasy of passion, and she had chosen him again each day during those difficult years back home at Urengard. His impetuous passion in place of her father's love, which would not allow even the wind to touch her harshly. She had refused the destiny that her father had wished for her when he wanted to put her into the arms of a man who would have safely led her onto the most secure paths, even bending down to remove every little pebble that she might tread upon. She had chosen to follow the other man, whom she knew travelled on dangerous paths. Monks and priests had pointed out remorse and repentance as the road home to peace, but she had chosen strife rather than give up her precious sin. Holy Olav, help me, so that I do not now prove unworthy of my Father's love. Once again, Kristen spoke the words of a prayer to the Virgin into the red of the evening. Hail Mary, full of grace. I dare not ask you for more than one thing. I see that now. Save Erland, save my husband's life. By refusing the destiny her father has set for her, Kristen seems to imperil her salvation, but this is in appearance only. God always finds another way. The cross is precisely the point where our way and God's ways intersect, seemingly opposed, running at right angles. The distinct paths nonetheless coincide in moments such as these, where Kristen is given the grace to accept the path that her father, Lavrans, and God, respecting her freedom, allowed her to travel, even though it was not the path they would have chosen for her. Lavrans had wanted to give Kristen to Simon. Kristen had thought about offering her life to God in the convent. She throws both possibilities away to marry Erland, but she never stops suffering for her decision, even in the act of making it. The suffering is part of the grace that she has received, as it reminds her that she is always free to make the right choice at the next moment. The next such dilemma for Kristen presents itself when, in the cross, she visits Simon, the man she had refused to marry and who is now married to her sister, Ramborg. Simon and Ramborg's son, Andres, is gravely ill and seemingly about to die. Kristen cannot bear the thought that God will take him away, and so she determines to use witchcraft, which she has learnt from Fru Aschhild, to cure Andres. She consciously chooses to do evil so that good may come from it. You must arrange things so that you are alone in here when I come back. She spoke as if her throat and mouth were parched. Sit with him, and when you see me enter, don't say a word, and never speak of this again, not to me or to anyone, not even to your priest. Simon got to his feet and slowly walked over to her. He had grown pale. No, Kristen. His voice was almost inaudible. I don't dare for you to do this thing. She put on her cloak and took a linen cloth from the chest in the corner, folded it up, and hid it in her bodice. But I dare. You understand that no one must come near us afterward until I call. No one must come near to us or speak to us until he wakes up and speaks himself. What do you think your father would say of this? He whispered in the same faint voice. Kristen, don't do it. In the past, I have done things that my father thought were wrong. Back then, it was merely to further my own desire. Andres is his flesh and blood too. My own flesh, Simon, my only sister's son. Simon took in a heavy, trembling breath. He stood with eyes downcast. But if you don't want me to make this last attempt. He stood as before, with his head bowed, and did not reply. Then Kristen repeated her question, unaware that an odd little smile, almost scornful, had appeared on her white lips. Do you want me to go? She knew that if it had been one of her own children, she would not have dared make this last attempt, to turn away God's hand when he reached out for a living soul. It was clear she would be a different person after this. Kristen sins for seemingly selfless reasons, but her decision violates God's law, is a clear choice for the flesh over the spirit, and is also motivated in part by her feelings of contempt for Simon. She wants to make him complicit in her decision, and she does so because she wants him to feel the sting of sin, the way she felt it when she rejected him for Erland. Psychologically, Kristen wants to feel that the man she rejected all those years ago is not, after all, as good a man as Lavrans believed him to be. That in fact, he is no better than Erland. As Undset writes, entering Kristen's thoughts, because you too, Simon, acquiesced when the dearest thing you possessed on earth was at stake, you agreed to more than anyone can accept with full honour. The final and most important choice that confronts Kristen occurs in the closing stages of the trilogy. By this time, she is a widow living as a nun in a convent. Having entered the cloister, one has the sense initially that Kristen has finally arrived home, but the definitive moment of her conversion is ahead of her. Plague is sweeping the land. Rumours spread that people are returning to heathen practices, including child sacrifice to the goddess Hel. Finally, a child whose mother has caught the plague is abducted by the villagers and readied for sacrifice. Kristen stands up. We must go out there. We can't just sit here while Christian souls sell themselves to the devil right on our doorstep. She liberates the child and confronts the villagers. Go home and thank God you were saved before you committed an act you might never be able to atone for. Echoing the high priest during the trial of Christ, one of the men calls out, "Isn't it better to sacrifice one than for all of us to perish?" The boy here, who belongs to no one. To which Kristen responds, "He belongs to Christ. Better for us all to perish than for us to harm one of his children." By saving the child and facing down the villagers and the lure of the heathen goddess, Kristen reverses the work of the demons that she had released when using the occult to save her nephew. But this comes because she first identifies with the child's persecutors. "I am like you. I am not like the Holy Sisters. I am one of you." Challenged by the villagers to prove her virtue by recovering the body of the child's mother, who has now died, Kristen goes to the stinking, plague-ridden body and brings it back for Christian burial, thus fulfilling one of the corporal works of mercy. As a result, she catches the disease and dies without her wedding ring, with a final thought as the priest ministers to her. The gold ring was gone. On the brown, rough flesh, it was quite clear, like a scar on thin white skin. She thought she could even make out 2 round circles from the rubies on either side, and a tiny scratch, an M, from the centre of the ring, where the holy symbol of the Virgin Mary had been etched in gold. The last clear thought that took shape in her mind was that she was happy, going to die before the mark had time to fade. It seemed to her a mystery that she could not comprehend, but she was certain that God had held her firmly in a pact which had been made for her without her knowing it, from a love that had been poured over her, and in spite of her willfulness, in spite of her melancholy, earthbound heart. Some of that love had stayed inside her, had worked on her like the sun on the earth, had driven forth a crop that neither the fiercest fire of passion nor its stormiest anger could completely destroy. She had been a servant of God, a stubborn, defiant maid, most often an eye-servant in her prayers and unfaithful in her heart, indolent and neglectful, impatient towards admonishments, inconstant in her deeds. And yet, he had held her firmly in his service, and under the glittering ring, a mark had been secretly impressed upon her, showing that she was his servant, owned by the Lord and King who would now come, born on the consecrated hands of the priest, to her release and salvation. The difficulty of arriving at this moment, through the narrow gate, as it were, is made clear from the sympathy the reader experiences earlier in the novel for Erland's predicament in his final hour, when he refuses the ministrations of a priest who has calumniated Kristen and called her honour into question. According to Erland's code, he would be betraying his wife's honour by agreeing to receive the last rites from Sira Solomon's hands. We certainly feel, as distinct from think, that Erland is right to refuse the sacraments in these circumstances. However, the decision means that Erland is deprived of the last rites and a good death, since he is divided in his last moments between the law of God and the law of man. By contrast, Kristen meets her death with a spirit of complete abandonment to God's law. But she does so not really despite Erland, but in a sense with him, because of him, and for him. Her wedding ring, marking their union, now released from her finger, has indelibly marked her as a daughter of Mary, and the bride of Erland has become a bride of Christ.